There was a time when the lights of the disco floor felt like they could shine forever. The bass thumped, the crowd moved as one, and a new wave of sound began to rise across America. In the middle of that moment stood a group that refused to blend into the background, a band whose rhythm would change the pulse of the late 1970. That group was A Taste of Honey, and their story is far more complex than the glitter that once surrounded them. What happens when a band reaches the top of the charts, wins a Grammy, and still finds themselves fading from the spotlight long before their legacy is complete? Let's get into their story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Long before A Taste of Honey became a name woven into the fabric of American disco, their story began in the quieter corners of Southern California. It was the early 1970, a period when the music scene was shifting, expanding, and redefining itself. Soul, funk, and R&B shaped the airwaves, while disco was still an unnamed energy forming in underground clubs. The idea of a female-driven band, one where the women not only sang but played their instruments with skill and authority, was almost unheard of. Yet the world was about to meet a group of women who were determined to rewrite those expectations. Their journey started with Janice Marie Johnson, a young musician whose relationship with music ran deeper than performance. She played bass with a precision and warmth rarely seen from any player, male or female. Music was not her escape, it was her language. Around the same time, keyboardist Perry Kibble was walking his own path, navigating the California music circuit in search of a project that felt meaningful. Fate brought them together during an audition on a vacation cruise, an unexpected place for a life-changing meeting, but one that set everything in motion. Johnson and Kibble recognized an undeniable chemistry in their musical styles. They shared a similar discipline, a similar hunger, and a similar respect for craft. They decided to form a band, one rooted not in gimmicks or manufactured image, but in musicianship. They named this new project after a song they both loved, a tune that captured the sweetness and depth they hoped to create. That name was A Taste of Honey. But a band is more than a pair of musicians. Over time, Johnson and Kibble brought in friends and collaborators from the vibrant club scene in Southern California. They rehearsed relentlessly, shaping a sound that blended funk, soul, and emerging disco elements. Their early performances took place in small clubs, bars, and lounges, places where they had to win over audiences one night at a time. These rooms were not glamorous, and they offered no promise of stardom, but they served as the crucible where the band found its identity. The lineup solidified when guitarist Hazel Payne joined the group. Her arrival occurred after guitarist Greg Walker left to join Santana, and it changed the dynamics of the band profoundly. Payne was not just a skilled player. She was charismatic, sharp, and visually captivating. The combination of Johnson, Payne, Kibble, and drummer Donald Johnson created a rare balance. Each member played a critical role, and together they offered something few bands could match, a fully formed ensemble with undeniable chemistry. Still, talent alone was not enough. For 6 years, A Taste of Honey worked tirelessly to elevate their craft. They performed at military bases and United Service Organizations events, traveling far beyond the borders of Los Angeles. Their tours took them through Spain, Morocco, Taiwan, Thailand, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. These journeys exposed them to new audiences, new cultures, and new sounds. They learned how to connect with crowds who did not speak their language, relying solely on the music they carried with them. Night after night, they grew more seasoned, more confident, and more certain that they had something unique to offer the industry. The USO tours also shaped the emotional core of their performances. Playing for service members stationed far from home gave the band a deeper understanding of connection and resilience. They saw how music could shift the weight of loneliness, even for a moment. These experiences strengthened their bond and sharpened their purpose. They were no longer just a young band trying to make it. They had become a group with a message, a sound, and an identity forged through experience. When they finally returned to Los Angeles, they were not the same musicians who had left. They had a stronger presence, a tighter sound, and a renewed sense of direction. One night, while performing in a nightclub, producers F. and Larry Mizell happened to be in the audience. The band played with the same precision and passion they had shown around the world, unaware that their lives were about to change. The producers were impressed and arranged for Capitol Records executives to hear them. The audition that followed was the culmination of years of work, discipline, and belief. A Taste of Honey passed that audition with ease. Capitol Records offered them a contract, opening the door to a future none of them could have fully imagined. It was the moment every young musician dreams of, yet only a few ever reach. Their years of sacrifice had finally brought them to the threshold of something larger than themselves. And the world, though it did not know it yet, was about to hear a song that would define an era. When A Taste of Honey entered the studio to record their debut album, they carried with them the weight of 6 years spent learning stages, audiences, and themselves. Capitol Records believed in their potential, but the band knew that belief alone was not enough. They needed a song that could cut through the noise of a crowded music scene, a track that captured their identity as musicians who refused to be overlooked. That spark arrived in the most unexpected way, through frustration. During a performance for a military audience, the crowd remained stiff and unresponsive. They stood still even as the band gave everything they had on stage. Janice Marie Johnson felt something tighten inside her, a quiet anger mixed with disappointment. After the show, she picked up her bass and improvised a line that pulsed with attitude and defiance. That riff became the heartbeat of a new idea, a groove built on the demand that people stop, listen, and move. The song that emerged from that moment would change their lives. They called it Boogie, Oogie, Oogie. In the studio, the band refined the track until every note felt alive. Johnson's bass line was infectious, grounded yet playful, giving the song its unmistakable character. Hazel Payne's guitar added rhythm and spark, weaving through the arrangement with precision. Perry Kibble's keyboards gave the track its disco and funk identity, and Donald Johnson held everything together with a beat that never lost its momentum. The chemistry they had built on the road now came into full focus. Once finished, the group knew they had something powerful, but none of them fully understood just how far it would go. When Boogie Oogie Oogie was released in the summer of 1978, it did not simply enter the charts, it exploded. Radio stations played it non-stop. Clubs embraced it instantly. By the fall of 1978, the song had reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It surpassed 2 million copies sold, becoming the first platinum single in Capitol Records history. The world could not resist the groove that A Taste of Honey had created, and for a moment, they were everywhere. Their success was not only commercial, it was cultural. Boogie Oogie Oogie became a defining anthem of the disco era. Its opening riff was instantly recognizable. Its energy captured a moment in American nightlife when people filled dance floors searching for joy, expression, and escape. And for a group led by women who played their own instruments, the success represented something even deeper, a challenge to long-standing industry assumptions about what women could do in music. On the strength of that single, their self-titled debut album found an audience of its own. The follow-up track, Do It Good, reached #13 on the R&B charts and #79 on the pop charts, proving that the group was more than just one song. The momentum was building, and for the first time, A Taste of Honey felt the weight of recognition. They were no longer the band fighting for attention in nightclubs or performing for indifferent crowds on faraway bases. They were chart-topping artists with a voice in the industry. But with every rise comes the quiet whisper of uncertainty. Success can be a gift, but it can also be the beginning of pressure. And while A Taste of Honey had stepped into the spotlight with confidence, the next steps would test their resilience in ways they could not yet imagine. The success of Boogie Oogie Oogie placed A Taste of Honey in a position that many young bands dream of but few are prepared to navigate. Their rise was quick, dazzling, and full of promise. Yet once the applause settled and the initial shock of fame began to fade, the group found themselves facing a difficult truth. Their follow-up album, Another Taste, released the following year, failed to capture the same momentum. The charts were quieter, the radio stations less enthusiastic, and the industry began whispering the phrase no artist ever wants to hear, one-hit wonder. Inside the group, change was forming. The chemistry that had held them together through years of rehearsal and touring began to shift. Eventually, the band restructured, leaving Janice Marie Johnson and Hazel Payne as the remaining core members. Instead of being discouraged, the duo saw this as an opportunity to reshape their sound and redefine who they were. They were determined not to let their careers be reduced to a single song, no matter how successful that song had been. During a tour in Japan, Johnson discovered something unexpected. She found herself singing the melody of a song she had known for years, a classic by Japanese artist Kyu Sakamoto, titled Sukiyaki. The audience recognized it instantly. Something about that moment stayed with her. It was a reminder of how music could bridge cultures, languages, and oceans. When she returned to the United States, she could not shake the idea of reimagining the song with English lyrics. Johnson reached out to her Japanese sub-publisher, who then contacted the original composers. Translators were hired, and one provided an English adaptation that echoed the themes of loss and reflection found in the original. Johnson added her own lyrics as well, though she initially felt they were too simple. Her producer, George Duke, encouraged her to trust her instincts, reminding her that sincerity mattered more than complexity. But before the song could be released, a major obstacle appeared. A publishing rights issue threatened to stop the project completely. One of the original writers had signed away his rights, creating legal complications that required Johnson to relinquish her own share in the English version. She hesitated, knowing the sacrifice it required, yet she also sensed the potential of the song. In the end, she agreed, choosing the music over the money. Even then, Capitol Records showed little enthusiasm for the track. They chose to release Rescue Me instead, a song that managed to reach number 16 on the R&B chart but did little to change the group's standing. Later came I'm Talking About You, which peaked at number 64. These releases provided some movement but not enough to reclaim the attention they once held. It took persistent radio play of the album track Sukiyaki for the label to finally reconsider. Pressure grew, and eventually Capitol released the song as a single. What happened next surprised almost everyone except perhaps Johnson herself. In the spring of 1981, Sukiyaki soared to number 1 on the R&B chart and number 3 on the pop chart. The song, delicate yet haunting, touched listeners in ways few expected. It sounded nothing like the disco anthem that had once made them famous. Instead, it revealed a vulnerability, a gentleness, and an emotional honesty that allowed A Taste of Honey to reinvent themselves completely. For Johnson and Payne, it was more than a comeback. It was validation. They were no longer tethered to the success of Boogie Oogie Oogie. They had proven that lightning could strike twice, even in an industry that often gives artists only one chance. What followed would lead them into the height of their careers, a moment when their place in music history felt secure. But even at their peak, the shadows of change were already gathering around them. When Sukiyaki climbed the charts and secured its place near the top, A Taste of Honey stepped into a new chapter of their career. This was not the explosive rise that came with Boogie Oogie Oogie, but rather a steady, confident resurgence. It was the kind of moment artists hope for after the world has decided their time has passed. Johnson and Payne had defied the odds, and now they were standing in a place very few artists had ever stood twice. The success of Sukiyaki brought a gentler spotlight than their first hit, one filled with respect rather than curiosity. Audiences were drawn not only to the melody, but to the sincerity behind it. It had a tenderness that felt timeless, a softness that stood apart from the high-energy pulse of disco. In an era defined by bright lights and crowded dance floors, the song offered something different, a moment to breathe. For many listeners, it was the first time they truly heard the emotional depth A Taste of Honey carried within their music. Their album, Twice as Sweet, benefited from the renewed attention. While not every track became a hit, the project showcased the band's versatility and musical maturity. Songs blended soul, quiet storm elements, and polished instrumentation, revealing that the group was capable of far more than people had given them credit for. The album marked a significant shift in how the industry viewed them. They were no longer the band with one unforgettable dance anthem. They were artists with range, intention, and a story. On stage, Johnson and Payne delivered performances that reflected this transformation. They carried themselves with the presence of women who had fought for their place and earned it. Johnson's bass lines remained a defining force in their live shows, anchoring each performance with clarity and confidence. Payne's guitar work added elegance and emotion, her tone capturing the blend of strength and vulnerability that defined their new era. Together, they created a dynamic that was both powerful and uniquely feminine, something rare in a field still dominated by male musicians. Their presence in pop culture also grew. They appeared on televised music shows, performed at large venues, and reached audiences that extended beyond disco fans. There was a renewed appreciation for artists who could bridge genres, who could shift from dance floor energy to melodic storytelling. A Taste of Honey now stood among the few groups capable of doing both. What made this moment particularly meaningful was the awareness that it had almost never happened. Had Johnson not held onto the memory of singing Sukiyaki in Japan, had she not pushed through the legal obstacles, had the label refused the growing radio support, their second rise might have never come. The triumph felt earned, carved out by persistence rather than luck. By the time the group settled into the early months of 1981, they were experiencing a rare kind of success, the kind that validated every risk they had taken. After years of reinvention, doubt, and near silence, A Taste of Honey found themselves back at the center of American music. Their sound had evolved, their image had shifted, and their legacy was beginning to take shape. It was a peak defined not by the glitter of disco floors, but by the steady glow of recognition. And yet, beneath that glow, the first hints of change were beginning to appear, subtle but inevitable, signaling that every rise carries with it the possibility of a fall. At the height of their success, A Taste of Honey stood in a place many artists spend a lifetime trying to reach. Yet even as their music found new listeners and their presence grew stronger, something quieter was happening beneath the surface. The music industry was changing. The sound of disco, once unstoppable, was beginning to lose its place on American radio. By the early days of 1981, what had been a cultural wave was slowly retreating, leaving behind only a handful of artists able to adapt. For Johnson and Payne, the shift felt subtle at first, almost like a breeze passing through an open door. But it was a sign of a storm that would eventually reshape everything around them. Despite their momentum, the pressure from the label grew heavier. Capitol Records wanted a clearer direction, a new angle, something that would keep the group relevant beyond the fading disco glow. Executives began suggesting image changes, new sound approaches, and tighter commercial expectations. The gentle sincerity of Sukiyaki had given them a second rise, but now the label wanted lightning to strike once more, and quickly. It was a demand that did not align with the artistic instincts of the duo. What had once been a partnership fueled by creativity began to feel more like a negotiation. Inside the group, the personal toll of fame also began to show. Years of touring, recording, and constant reinvention had left both women exhausted. They had carried the weight of being a female band in an industry that often dismissed or underestimated them. Every studio session came with reminders of expectations they had never asked for, and every public appearance added another layer of scrutiny. Behind the applause, they were fighting to stay intact. Their next project, Ladies of the 80s, arrived at a time when the industry was shifting towards new wave, rock, and emerging pop trends. The album struggled to find its place. Despite containing thoughtful tracks and polished production, it did not achieve the commercial success the label hoped for. Airplay was limited, promotion was minimal, the energy that had once surrounded them began to fade, and slowly, the group felt the fragile nature of fame tightening around them. For Hazel Payne, the change was more than professional. She felt drawn toward new artistic avenues, especially the world of theater. After years of performing with relentless intensity, she longed for a different kind of creative expression, one not tied to the unstable currents of the music industry. Her decision to leave the group marked the end of an era. It also left Johnson standing alone, responsible for completing the contractual obligations that had once been shared. The departure echoed louder than either woman expected. Without Payne's presence, the dynamic of A Taste of Honey shifted permanently. The duo that had reinvented themselves with patience and determination was no more. And while both women continued forward in their own ways, the loss left a void that could not be easily filled. By the time the last echoes of their peak settled, the truth was clear. The seeds of decline had already taken root during their brightest days. They had fought hard to reclaim their place in music, only to discover that success, once regained, could still be fragile. The spotlight that had once lifted them began to dim, not suddenly, but steadily, leaving them to face a new chapter, one shaped not by triumph, but by the quiet, inevitable weight of change. When the glow of their peak began to fade, A Taste of Honey found themselves facing something far more difficult than a changing music industry. For the first time since their beginnings, the path ahead was no longer clear. The applause that had once carried them through long nights on stage had become softer. The calls from the label, once filled with urgency, now felt distant. And beneath it all, the demands of the industry began to settle heavily on Janice Marie Johnson's shoulders. With Hazel Payne's departure, Johnson stood alone in a space that had always been shared. The responsibility to finish the group's contractual commitments with Capitol Records became hers entirely. She was no longer part of a duo fighting to stay relevant. She was a single artist expected to carry the weight of a band's legacy. It was a burden she never complained about publicly, but privately, it pressed against her spirit in ways few could understand. Recording her solo album, One Taste of Honey, was both a challenge and a heartbreak. Johnson poured herself into the music, hoping to capture the honesty and depth that had carried Sukiyaki to the top of the charts. But the industry had already turned its attention elsewhere. The disco era had ended. Radio programmers shifted toward new wave, rock, and the polished pop sound beginning to dominate the early 1980 period. As a result, no single from the project reached the commercial success she hoped for. The silence that followed was sharper than any criticism. Financial pressure soon followed emotional strain. Without strong sales or label support, opportunities became limited. The momentum that once seemed unstoppable had slowed to a crawl. Johnson's relationship with the industry grew strained, defined more by survival than by creativity. What had once been a dream now felt like a test, and every attempt to move forward came with new obstacles. Yet the crisis was not only professional. The years of touring, travel, and reinvention had taken a toll on the members personally. Perry Kibble, who had been part of the group's foundation, faced his own battles. His health began to decline, and though he remained a respected figure among musicians, the road he traveled grew more difficult. His passing in February 1999 at the age of 49 left a quiet ache in the hearts of those who knew him. It was another reminder of how fragile the journey could be. The emotional weight of these years did not come from dramatic collapses or public scandals. It came from the slow unraveling that many artists face when the world moves on without them. For Johnson, each day required resilience. She continued to perform, continued to write, continued to search for spaces where her music could be heard. But the gap between past success and present reality grew wider. There were moments when memories of the past felt like both comfort and burden. The thrill of their early hits, the energy of the crowds, the joy of creating something meaningful, these images lived within her. But they also reminded her of everything that had slipped away. It was a quiet grief, the kind that settles into the background of a life once lived in the spotlight. And yet, even during this period of uncertainty, the story of A Taste of Honey was far from finished. The crisis would shape them, but it would not define their legacy. Something else was waiting on the other side of the struggle, a testament to the idea that music, once created with truth, has a way of finding its way back into the world. As the years moved forward, the silence surrounding A Taste of Honey grew louder. The industry that once celebrated their rise now seemed to have turned its attention to the next new sound. Trends shifted, labels restructured, and audiences evolved. What remained for the women who once carried dance floors across America was a fading echo of their own accomplishments. It was a difficult reality, not because they lacked talent, but because time has a way of moving faster than any artist can chase. For Janice Marie Johnson, this period felt like walking through the remnants of a life that had once been vibrant. She continued to fulfill her commitments, performing when she could, recording when opportunities arose, and trying to navigate a world where success no longer came easily. But each step carried a quiet weight. The cheers that had once lifted her from stage to stage had softened into private memories. Even so, she refused to let those memories define her. She kept going, because music was still the language she trusted most. Meanwhile, the group's catalog found an unexpected second life through sampling. Rap and hip-hop producers, especially in the growing scenes of New York and Los Angeles, discovered new potential in A Taste of Honey's recordings. The riffs, melodies, and rhythmic foundations appeared in tracks by artists like Funky 4+1, Doug E. Fresh, Mary J. Blige, Fabulous, Big Daddy Kane, and Foxy Brown. Their work resurfaced in clubs and radios not through their own performances, but through the voices of a new generation. It was a bittersweet success. Their sound lived on, but their names were rarely attached to it. For some artists, this kind of rediscovery might have felt like renewal, but for A Taste of Honey, it only highlighted the distance between their contributions and the recognition they deserved. Their music was shaping new movements, yet they were no longer standing in the spotlight. They watched as others found glory through echoes of their sound, while they remained in the background. The loss of former group members made these years feel even heavier. Perry Kibble's passing had already cast a shadow over the band's history, but more sorrow followed when guitarist Suzanne Minnie Thomas died in June 2015 at the age of 60. Each loss added another layer of reflection, a reminder that time was taking pieces of their story with it. Hazel Payne, who had once shared the brightest stages with Johnson, had moved into a different artistic life entirely. Theater offered her a world where creativity was not dictated by charts or trends. She found fulfillment there, but her absence from the group left a gap that could never be fully replaced. Their reunion years later would bring healing, but during this period, the separation was a sign of how far things had drifted from the golden days. Through it all, Johnson remained the quiet anchor of their legacy. She continued to perform, continued to honor the music, and continued to carry the band's name into every room she entered. The industry's silence did not erase her determination. Instead, it strengthened her resolve to keep A Taste of Honey alive in whatever way she could. The consequences of their decline were not marked by scandal, anger, or public collapse. They were marked by endurance, by the resilience of someone who refused to abandon the art that shaped her life. And though the world no longer watched closely, the next chapter of their journey would prove that legacy does not fade just because fame does. Sometimes, what remains after the fall becomes more meaningful than the rise itself. As the years passed, the music of A Taste of Honey continued to echo far beyond the era that first gave it life. What the industry once viewed as a brief moment of disco brilliance gradually took on a deeper meaning. Their contributions were no longer measured only by chart positions or radio play. Instead, they became part of a larger conversation about musical innovation, representation, and the quiet strength of artists who dared to break barriers long before the world was ready to acknowledge them. Their earliest legacy rested on something simple but powerful. They were women who played their own instruments at a time when the industry rarely allowed that image to exist. On the stages of the 1970 period, the sight of Janice Marie Johnson holding a bass with authority or Hazel Payne delivering guitar lines with precision defied expectations. They challenged an unwritten rule within popular music, proving that talent and musicianship were not confined to any gender. In doing so, they opened a door that future groups would walk through with confidence. Bands like Climax and the Bangles would later rise to prominence, often celebrated for breaking molds and reshaping the landscape for women in music. Yet years before their emergence, A Taste of Honey had already carved a path. They provided a blueprint not through loud declarations, but through the quiet power of example. Every time Johnson's bass line anchored a performance or Payne's guitar added its emotional edge, they sent a message. Women belonged not just in the spotlight, but in the engine room of the music itself. Then there were the songs, pieces of art that refused to fade. Boogie Oogie Oogie remained a hallmark of the disco era, instantly recognizable from its first notes. Decade after decade, it resurfaced in films, commercials, and dance floors, reminding listeners of a time when music felt bold, joyful, and free. Sukiyaki, in contrast, carried a gentle weight. Its melancholy melody and heartfelt delivery allowed it to transcend genre and geography, creating a bond between cultures and generations. Their music also became woven into the growth of hip-hop and R&B. Producers sampled their rhythms, riffs, and textures, drawing new energy from the foundation A Taste of Honey had created. Their sound shaped tracks that defined the 1980 period and 1990 period, proving that influence does not always appear in the form of awards or headlines. Sometimes, it lives quietly in the DNA of new movements. Recognition eventually arrived in more formal ways. In 2008, Janice Marie Johnson was inducted into the Native American Music Association Hall of Fame, an honor that celebrated both her heritage and her artistic contributions. It was a moment that affirmed what many listeners had believed for decades. Her work mattered, not only to fans but to the broader story of American music. And through all the changes, their legacy continued to expand, shaped not by the rise and fall of fame, but by the endurance of the music they left behind. As time moved forward, the world began to reevaluate the place A Taste of Honey held in music history. What had once been viewed as a brief chapter in the disco era slowly revealed itself to be something far more significant. Across America, critics, historians, and longtime fans started looking back with a clearer understanding of what Johnson, Payne, and the group had accomplished. Their story became a reminder that influence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it waits for the world to catch up. In the United States, their music found a second life through nostalgia. Radio stations that celebrated classic R&B returned to their catalog, while documentaries and retrospectives highlighted their pioneering role as women who shaped the sound of a generation. Younger musicians discovered their work through samples and reinterpretations. Listeners who grew up with Boogie Oogie Oogie shared the song with their children, turning it into a multi-generational anthem. Sukiyaki continued to appear in playlists, films, and tributes, its quiet beauty resonating long after the last note faded. Internationally, they held a special place in countries that had embraced them during their early USO tours. In Japan, Sukiyaki remained a cultural bridge, connecting the legacy of Q Sakamoto with the emotional reinterpretation offered by A Taste of Honey. Fans across Asia remembered their performances not just as entertainment, but as moments of connection during times when overseas music felt rare and precious. Their global tours had given them a reach that extended beyond charts or awards, leaving memories deeply rooted in places far from Los Angeles. The group's influence also grew among artists who saw themselves reflected in Johnson and Payne. Women in rock, soul, funk, and R&B acknowledged their bravery. Musicians of Native American heritage found inspiration in Johnson's visibility and resilience. The more people examined the challenges the group faced, the more they understood the quiet courage it took for them to rise and reinvent themselves in an era that offered them few opportunities. What emerged from this reflection was not a story of a band that faded, but one of artists who were ahead of their time. A Taste of Honey may not have remained in the spotlight, but their impact settled into the foundation of American music, shaping artists, genres, and listeners in ways that were subtle yet enduring. They had been underrated once, but time, with its steady and patient hand, restored their place in the narrative. When we look back on the story of A Taste of Honey, it becomes clear that their journey was never just about chart success or the rise and fall of a musical era. It was about two women who stepped into a world that did not expect much from them and left behind a legacy far greater than the moment the spotlight allowed. Their music carried the joy of dance floors, the softness of quiet reflection, and the strength of artists who refused to be defined by what others believed they could or could not do. The glow of their early triumphs still lingers today. Boogie Oogie Oogie continues to fill rooms with movement, its bass line pulling people back to a time when music felt like freedom. Sukiyaki stands as a reminder that emotion can cross borders and languages, that a song born in one corner of the world can find a new voice thousands of miles away. These pieces of their history remain alive not because of trends or nostalgia alone, but because they captured something true about the human experience. As we reflect on their story, we are reminded that recognition does not always come when it should. Sometimes it arrives years later, carried by the people who remember. And that is where the legacy of A Taste of Honey truly lives, in the memories of listeners, in the artists they inspired. In the quiet persistence of Janice Marie Johnson, who still steps onto stages and plays with the same heart she carried decades ago. So now, the question becomes yours. Do you believe A Taste of Honey ever received the respect they deserved? Did their music play a part in your own memories, your own moments, your own life? If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to help preserve the voices and journeys of artists who shaped the spirit of American music, consider subscribing to the channel. Together, we can keep their light alive, one story at a time.